Good day, everyone. I'm Ethan, moderator for this webinar. Welcome everyone for today's webinar. Hospital medical staff, bylaws, problems and solutions. Update now. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today, Elizabeth Snelson. Elizabeth Snelson helps medical staff across the country with medical staff bylaws and works for medical societies on medical staff issues. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for your patience. You'll see in the slides that there's quite a bit of information available to you here. So we're talking about hospital medical staff bylaws and solutions and things that you should pay attention to now in order to update your bylaws. So what you should know is that your hospital medical staff bylaws have a lot of compliance responsibilities. Medical staff bylaws have to comply with specific provisions of the Medicare conditions of participation, which are in 482.22c. If your hospital is accredited by or seeking accreditation from the Joint Commission, then there are a number of medical staff bylaws standards that must be met. The major one is MS 10101. Every state has got a different approach to medical staff law and medical staff requirements. Basic compliance issues, it's important to keep your medical staff bylaws in tune with what the medical staff is doing now. I'll be using examples throughout the webinar that come from the Massachusetts Medical Society Model Medical Staff Bylaws, but it provides a good template for you to look at in deciding what language should work for your medical staff. It is Massachusetts specific. Another important issue to address right at the jump is in your bylaws, make sure that you're not setting yourselves up for inconsistencies among hospital medical staff documents. The bylaws are subject to amendment. And as you can see in this slide, Joint Commission standards require that the medical staff and the governing body share the responsibility for adopting the bylaws and any amendments. Now, under Joint Commission standards, it gets a little complicated. It can't be just the governing body. It can't be just the medical staff. It's got to be both. Here's an amendment process that lays out both the committee process and the medical staff process. It's important that the bylaws have a definition section. So it just makes it more streamlined, and it can prevent inherent inconsistencies, which are always problematic. Another major issue for medical staff bylaws is membership. Who qualifies? Who doesn't? Medical staff membership requirements should be in the bylaws and should indicate at least the basics. Licensure, for example, education, training, experience. I mentioned board certification as an example for membership. Membership has categories, typically active. Other options, though, for categories could be low volume members. Call coverage is another category of membership. So here's an example for active category. Have a look. A lot of times active category just means a certain number of patients or patient contacts per annum. Also make sure that you address the issue of employed members. Voting rights, it's important to specify those and make it clear who can vote. And as we learned during COVID, it's important that there be means of participating remotely. Credentialing is a key part of the medical staff responsibilities and needs to be delineated clearly in the medical staff bylaws. For example, one example that comes up in the credentialing area is what goes in the file, where it goes, who's responsible for controlling the credentials file, and this provision from the Massachusetts model. Privileges, major area for medical staff bylaws. Criteria, how criteria are determined, that process. Don't forget to provide for change. For example, resigning privileges. This is very important. So peer review is the big job of the medical staff. And it's important that the medical staff, again, contain processes for making peer review work and making peer review safe. Here's an example from the Massachusetts model on corrective action. Under Joint Commission standards, there needs to be a right to appeal. Here's, in these next 3 slides, are what is required for the hearing process to meet the standards of the federal law. But there it is. In those 3 slides are the requirements for federal law compliance for hearings. It's important to go into certain detail on issues like how there's going to be a hearing officer. In addition to all the corrective action requirements, there's so many other things that the medical staff does in addition to peer review. Unification and disunification, again, a fairly recent requirement under conditions of participation, can be many or few. It depends upon the sophistication of your medical staff and its size, that medical staffs have a health committee. Medical staff management is necessary. The medical staff needs to be managed, and there's so many different ways to approach it. Identify what kind of supports are necessary for the medical staff to be managed professionally. Here, for example, is a sample language that talks about how information needs to be kept confidential. I also recommend, everybody hates parliamentary authority, but it really can be helpful. I mentioned don't put an age in for your requirements for membership. You can't discriminate on age. However, the medical staff is responsible. Conflict of interest, I've mentioned a couple of times. The medical staff is a sophisticated organization, and be aware that the hospital has a compliance code that deals with a lot of these issues. For the hospital, the medical staff needs to have its own approach to many of those issues, and particularly needs to make sure that the medical staff bylaws are not in conflict with the hospital's compliance code, and vice versa. Here's one way to do it, is to make sure that the medical staff is involved in coordinating compliance. Make sure there's a code of conduct in your bylaws. The Joint Commission calls for it. It's complicated, but it's worth it. Same with, again, employment of physicians. So again, here's a best practice on dealing with the issues of employed or contracted members vis-a-vis the medical staff bylaws. I recommend dispute resolution be addressed right in the bylaws. The Joint Commission calls for it, and every medical staff needs it. Make sure, though, that what isn't part of dispute resolution is peer review. We've got processes for peer review in the hearing and appeals. With that, I'll leave you with some resources. I'd like to, again, thanks everyone for your attendance and your participation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That does conclude the session for today. Thank you everyone for participating. You all may disconnect now. You all have a great day ahead. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you.